Welcome. I've got some great news for you. Santa Claus is coming to town and he wants to make a deal. He's looking for somebody to build a toy factory right across the street from his distribution facility and wants to know if that's an agreement you would like to make. Hopefully this video will help you answer that question. The topic of this video is the boundaries of the firm. This includes both vertical scope or vertical integration, thinking about the activities in a value chain and the resources necessary for each step of the value chain, and whether or not it makes sense to coordinate those activities within a single firm or between firms. A lot of these concepts are also relevant to the horizontal scope of the firm with horizontal diversification, but primarily we'll be focused on vertical integration for the purposes of this video. The big idea that will help us make sense of whether or not an activity should be done within a single firm or coordinated across multiple firms is governance costs. There's always governance costs, whether or not it's a transaction between separate businesses, in which case you have transaction costs, or whether the activity is being done within a single firm, in which case you have ownership costs. For the purposes of this discussion, we'll be focused on a given level of synergistic value, and then asking the question of whether or not the governance costs are lower if you are doing this between firms or within a single firm. Within transaction cost economics, which is motivating a lot of this discussion, there is the goal of minimizing the sum of production costs and transaction costs. For the purposes of our discussion, we're going to think of production costs as being factored into that synergistic value, and holding that synergistic value constant are governance costs lower with transaction costs or with ownership costs. You can probably imagine some synergies that are only possible to organize in one way. Perhaps that's between firms or within a firm. In that case, you can think of the governance costs for creating synergies in the impossible way as being infinite. So hopefully you're wondering, why would transaction costs sometimes be lower than ownership costs and other times be higher than ownership costs? We'll be focusing on two factors for the purposes of this discussion. Those factors are resource modification and synergy asymmetry. So that for that second one, asymmetry means that one side is incurring the cost of creating the synergy and the other side is realizing the benefit from that. When you think about the left side of this with low resource modification and synergy symmetry, where both sides benefit, those would be synergies that are in the fits quadrant of the synergistic portfolio framework. If you remember that framework, those fits have benefits flowing both to the business unit and to the rest of the organization based on the presence of that business unit. It might seem intuitive or obvious that fits are ideal to have within a corporate portfolio, but in fact, when the synergies are symmetric and both sides benefit from working together, it's often not necessary to combine those both within a single firm. You can actually transact between firms at a lower cost, and because both sides are benefiting, they're happy to work together. However, once resource modification is higher and synergies are asymmetric, then transaction costs increase relative to ownership costs more quickly. So when you have that, you can think of the difference between transaction costs and ownership costs as corporate advantage. And if those business units are held within a single firm and they're creating that synergistic value at lower cost, then they are creating corporate advantage. So especially if you remember the 4C framework, we're talking about resource modifications, that is consolidation synergies and customization synergies. Consolidation synergies tend to be asymmetric all the time. Customization synergies can go either way. So you may have two business units modifying the resources of each of them to work better together, or you could have one business unit making modifications to their resources, and that increases value for the other business unit. So especially when those customization synergies are asymmetric, it becomes more difficult to manage that between firms as opposed to within a single firm. So a little bit more about ownership costs. When you think about ownership within a single firm, the benefits of that are improved communication and coordination. When both businesses report up to a single executive, that executive is able to tell each side what's going on and what they should do, and can also order both sides to share any relevant information with the other business. However, there are some costs to ownership. A big one of those is lower powered incentives. So if you think about two independent businesses choosing to work together, each of them is competing against other potential suppliers in order to gain that partner. And because they're competing against other suppliers, they have a strong incentive to create as much value as possible and work together in order to capture part of that value. If you have two business units within a single firm, you are lowering those individual incentives because you want to incentivize cooperation, but that also reduces the competition to keep or gain a particular customer because that customer is internal. So the incentives to create as much value as possible are not quite as strong. When you have ownership, you also have an extra layer of management. So if you think of two independent business units, they have all the necessary layers of management for each of them. But when you bring them together into a single organization, you have at least one more layer of management on top of that. That not only has a cost, it can also slow down decision making. In addition to that, resource allocation decisions can become more difficult or contentious. If you think about capital allocation through financial markets, arguably the investors are more objective about the value of each business, and they can decide whether or not it makes sense to continue reinvesting with that business, or if it makes more sense to return capital to shareholders. But when you have two businesses within a single firm, there are incentives for managers to keep reinvesting in each of those and not favor one business over the other. So that can lead to inefficient capital allocation. That's often referred to as an internal capital market. And it's generally assumed that if you have a functioning capital market, that the internal capital market will be less efficient. On the other side, we have transaction costs, reversing some of the benefits of or some of the costs of ownership. When you have transactions between firms, you have strong incentives to create and capture value. You are really motivated to create value for potential partners so that they will choose to work with you. So that's a benefit of market transactions, but you also have a lot of other costs that come with that. First, you have search and information costs. You need to consider all these different potential partners and decide which of them is best for working with you and how reliable they might be or how trustworthy they might be. Even after you find the best possible partner, you have bargaining costs. So even if you know that you can create a lot of value with a particular partner, you still have to negotiate over who will capture more of that value. And that takes time and effort to do that negotiation and bargaining. And finally, after you make the deal, you still need to worry about monitoring and enforcement. If this is an arm's length transaction through the market, it can be a little bit more difficult to monitor exactly what they're doing and whether or not they're holding up their end of the deal. And if you find out that they're not, then you need to try to resolve that. There may be litigation or arbitration or something like that. So all of these add costs to transacting through the market. So you might be wondering, now that we have a discussion of what ownership costs are and what transaction costs are, why would resource modification and asymmetric synergies increase transaction costs relative to ownership costs. The reason for that is that with resource modification, and especially with one-sided synergies, those increase the risk of opportunism or holdup. So holdup or opportunism is a very big idea. It's been extensively developed in transaction cost economics. Kind of the central question of this and thinking about holdup and opportunism is, can I trust you to work with me and not take advantage of me? And that is especially important when I need to make a transaction-specific investment. So if I'm investing in a resource that is valuable to you and you have not had to make a similar commitment to me, what's going to motivate me to make that investment if I'm worried about you taking advantage of me after I've done that? There are three factors that really drive this risk of opportunism or holdup. And we'll be thinking about each of those and what that means for organization. The first is the frequency of transactions. If a transaction is going to be needed over and over, that means that there's a lot of dependence going into the future. And because the future is inherently less certain than the present, and because things change over time, even if you are certain about what that looks like, having high transaction frequency can increase dependence on another partner, and that increases the risk of opportunism. Related to that, when you have frequent and ongoing transactions, it's also easier to justify the cost of internalizing an activity. So you often see increased internal organization as transaction frequency increases. Another question is about asset specificity or idiosyncratic investments. So the issue here is if one side needs to invest in a resource that's uniquely valuable to the other, how do you incentivize that and minimize the risk of opportunism or holdup? Intuitively, at first glance, you might be thinking that if I make something uniquely valuable to you, that makes you dependent on me. But it's actually the reverse. If I make something that's very valuable as long as I'm partnering with you, but it's much less valuable if I work with anybody else, that creates risk and allows you to take advantage of me. If you choose to renegotiate for a better price, I don't really have options for reallocating those idiosyncratic resources to working with anybody else because I made an investment in something that's uniquely valuable to you. That resource is much less valuable if I try to work with anybody else using that resource. And finally, uncertainty. What if my needs unexpectedly change and we need to renegotiate the terms of the deal? That kind of combines with these first couple issues with transaction frequency and asset specificity. If the future changes and we need to renegotiate, if I am dependent on you, that allows you to have power over me in the negotiation and allows you to renegotiate terms in a way that's more favorable to you than to me. So with high transaction frequency, asset specificity, and uncertainty, it tends to make sense to increase internal control over the resources being created. This is kind of along a continuum, which we'll discuss in a couple minutes. But first, I want to return to that transaction that was proposed at the beginning of this video. So again, Santa Claus has come to town and he wants you to build a toy factory at the North Pole. What are the risks of opportunism or holdup if you choose to do that? So first, you have high transaction frequency. You will be selling toys to Santa on a very regular basis. So you have continued dependence over time. You also have very high asset specificity. Those costs of shipping your toys to Santa's distribution network are very low because Santa's reindeer storage facility, if you want to call it that, is right across the street. So positioning your toy factory at the North Pole is really great as long as you're selling your toys to Santa. But if Santa decides to renegotiate or back out of the deal, suddenly you need to ship your toys from the North Pole to some other location around the world. You may have to do that by air and you don't have reindeer. You might have to walk those toys or truck those toys over the ice. If the North Pole melts, you might have to ship those toys. All of those are much more expensive than just shipping the toys across the street. And that creates a lot of holdup risk. So again, you've created a resource, a toy factory that's uniquely valuable if working with Santa. But if Santa decides to back out of that deal, that toy factory is worth much, much less to you now if you try to sell to any other customer. Finally, you have uncertainty. Uncertainty is not super high with Christmas. As long as I've been around, it seems to come pretty much every year. But I don't know, the world's a little crazy right now. Maybe we won't have Christmas next year. So uncertainty could create risk for opportunism. If Christmas gets canceled this year, you may need to renegotiate and find some other way to make something of value and sell that. That creates even more dependence on Santa to allow that. And if you ask to renegotiate, the renegotiation may not be favorable to you. So with all of these, it seems like there's a lot of risk if you're negotiating with Santa Claus. I don't know if I trust Santa. It's probably better for Santa to vertically integrate and make all those toys in-house, and that gives complete control. It aligns incentives, and it reduces that risk of opportunism or holdup. And again, the reason that makes sense for Santa to vertically integrate is because it would be very difficult for Santa Claus to motivate you to build that toy factory because that risk of opportunism and holdup is so high. So kind of pulling these ideas together, first, we'll kind of combine the idea of transaction frequency and resource modification. So if you have recurring transactions and highly idiosyncratic investments necessary to create value, internal organization probably makes the most sense, or vertical integration if we're thinking about the vertical scope of the firm. At the other extreme, if the resources are completely standard or non-specific and rarely needed, then market transactions may make the most sense. But there's a continuum of choices between these, which we'll be talking more about in later videos. But we have alliances and joint ventures, which you can think of as sort of an escalation or increased internal control without going all the way to full ownership. And if the resource characteristics are mixed or transaction frequency increases, then having these deeper relationships may be necessary to create the most value. Finally, the third dimension, uncertainty. Traditionally, within transaction cost economics, uncertainty is seen as something that can be managed with increased control. So if you remember, the risk with holdup is that if my needs change and I need to renegotiate in the future, that can give you bargaining power over me, and I may need to renegotiate based on unfavorable terms. A common solution to that is seen as integrating so that that negotiation does not need to happen. And if needs change, I have complete control over the inputs and outputs and can make changes as necessary. From a strategy perspective, I like to think about the investment characteristics and resource modification as more of an endogenous decision. So while you can manage uncertainty through increased control, you can also manage uncertainty by using more standard inputs. To use an example of a specific 4C synergy, you can create customization synergies where the resources of two parts of the value chain or two businesses can be modified to be more valuable when used together. If you're doing that investment, it may make sense to do that within a single firm. But if you're not really sure about the value of that investment over the long term, if there's a lot of uncertainty, it could also make sense to just rely on more standard inputs and not create that particular synergy. And by not creating that customization and co-specialization, if the world does change, then you can more flexibly adapt to that by just switching to different standardized inputs. So that's it for thinking about governance costs and internal control versus transacting through the marketplace. So are we creating this synergistic value internally or externally? I know this is a really big topic. It's a pretty long video. If you have any questions, definitely feel free to ask. If you enjoyed this video, you can smash that like button. I've heard that's what the kids are doing these days. Also, feel free to subscribe if you want to see more content like this in the future. Thank you.